The thermometer nailed to
Ah,
the
this
post
warmth is a
outside
true
Gunnar
blessing on
Torvald's
such a
cabin
cold
read
day.
18 degrees
Let
below
me add
zero
another log to
on the
keep the
morning
fire
of
going.
January 11th,
There, that
1876.
should burn
He
nicely.
stood in his doorway, breath crystallizing into ice the moment it left his lungs, and he figured that made him the smartest man in Pembina County, Dakota Territory. He had built his chimney the way his father had built them, the way his father's father had built them back in the old country in the mountains outside Bergen, where winter came hard and stayed long, straight up through the roof where heat belonged, drawing smoke toward heaven and keeping the fire burning clean. He had already gone through 11 cords of split oak since November, but that was the price of survival on the northern plains. That was what it was to keep a family alive when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze the sap inside standing trees. Gunnar pulled his collar tighter and squinted across the frozen expanse of prairie, maybe 300 yards south where the land dipped toward the Tongue River. He was looking at the spot where the Russian woman had built her home, if you could call it a home, more like a grave she had dug for herself and then moved into. Smoke was not rising from her chimney. Smoke had not risen from her chimney in 3 days. Gunnar turned back inside where his wife Ingrid was stirring a pot of oats over the fire. Their children, three of them, sat bundled in blankets near the hearth, waiting for breakfast. The cabin was warm enough, 58 degrees, not comfortable but survivable. The chimney was drawing well despite the cold pulling smoke up and out the way God intended smoke to travel. She is dead, Gunnar said. The Russian woman. Finally frozen to death in that ridiculous dirt hole she insisted on building. Somebody ought to ride out there, come spring, to see about burying whatever is left of her. Ingrid did not look up from her stirring. You do not know that. 3 days without smoke. What else could it mean? Maybe her chimney works different than ours. Gunnar almost laughed. There is no different. There is physics. There is the way fire works. Hot air rises. That is not Norwegian wisdom or American wisdom. That is just truth. You cannot fight it. You cannot build some kind of underground contraption and expect heat to behave in ways heat does not behave. He sat down at the table and accepted the bowl his wife placed in front of him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the single glass window he had freighted all the way from Grand Forks. 18 below zero, and the day was only beginning. 300 yards south in a dugout carved into the earth beside the frozen bend of the Tongue River, Elena Volkov sat in her shirt sleeves reading a German Bible by the light of a single oil lamp. The thermometer hanging from a nail near her sleeping platform read 71 degrees. She had not lit a fire since yesterday morning. She did not plan to light another one until tomorrow. The packed earth beneath her feet radiated warmth like a living thing he'd absorbed from a small fire she had burned for 2 hours at dawn, stored in 6 tons of clay and river sand and crushed limestone released slowly through the day and night and into the next morning. She was not cold. She was not worried. She was not dead. She was waiting. Elena Volkov had arrived in Pembina County in May of 1874, one of 42 homesteaders who filed claims that year under the provisions of the Homestead Act. She was 31 years old. She spoke broken English with an accent thick enough to cut with a hay knife, the kind of accent that made Americans slow their speech and raise their voices as if she were deaf rather than foreign. She had traveled 4,000 miles from the Volga River basin to the banks of the Tongue, and she had carried exactly 3 things with her on that journey: a leather satchel containing her dead husband's naturalization papers, a tarnished icon of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, small enough to fit in her palm, and a rolled set of drawings her grandfather had made of a Pechka stove back in Saratov Oblast, diagrams inked on paper so old it cracked at the edges when she unrolled it. The drawings showed something that looked wrong to American eyes, something that made the land office clerk in Grafton laugh out loud when she tried to explain it. The clerk was a young man, maybe 25, with a waxed mustache and the confidence of someone who had never been truly cold in his life. He looked at the drawings with their strange horizontal channels and their low-profile chimney and their notation in Cyrillic script, and he laughed the way men laugh when they encounter something they do not understand and choose to find it amusing rather than admit their ignorance. That is not how chimneys work, he said. You understand that, right? I mean, I know you people do things different over there, but there are certain laws, physical laws, scientific laws. Elena did not try to explain again. She had learned that lesson already somewhere on the endless train journey from New York, somewhere between the crowded immigrant processing halls in the flat emptiness of Minnesota. Some things could not be explained. Some things had to be demonstrated. She filed her claim on a quarter section where the Tongue River made a lazy bend through the prairie, where a stand of cottonwood trees offered the only timber for miles in any direction, where a spring fed cold, clear water year-round, even in the depths of winter. The soil was black loam rich enough and deep enough to lose your arm to the elbow if you thrust it straight down. Good land. Land that would grow wheat or corn or whatever else she asked it to grow once she survived long enough to plant it. The clerk processed her paperwork with the amused efficiency of a man who expected never to see her again. Women did not survive alone on the Dakota frontier. Certainly not foreign women who did not speak proper English and who carried around drawings of heating systems that violated basic physics. He figured she would be back in Minneapolis by August, if not on a ship back to wherever she came from. He was wrong about the chimney. He was wrong about Elena. And in 20 months, when the worst blizzard in a generation came screaming down from Manitoba, he would understand just how wrong a man could be about staying warm on the northern plains. Elena's nearest neighbor was a Norwegian man named Gunnar Torvalds, who had filed the claim adjacent to hers back in '73. Gunnar was 43 years old, broad across the shoulders with hands roughened by decades of work and a face weathered by winters that would have killed softer men. He had brought his wife Ingrid and their 3 children west from a failing farm in Wisconsin, chasing the promise of free land and a fresh start. He had survived the first terrible winter of '73 to '74, when temperatures dropped to 38 below, and stayed there for 11 days straight when he had burned through his entire winter supply of wood by February and had to burn furniture to keep his children alive. He knew what winter meant on these plains. He knew what it cost. And when he saw Elena Volkov arrive that spring with her single trunk and her foreign accent and her rolled-up drawings, he knew she was going to die. He told her so directly the first time they met. He walked the 300 yards from his cabin to her claimed land, where she was pacing off the dimensions of something with a length of rope, and he told her the truth as he understood it. You will not survive one winter alone. Elena looked at him. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with dark hair pulled back from a face that showed no particular expression. Her eyes were the color of river ice, pale and gray, and utterly calm. She held the rope in her hands, and she looked at this large Norwegian man who had come to deliver her death sentence, and she did not argue with him. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Then she went back to her pacing. Gunnar stood there for a moment, unsure what to do with a response that was neither agreement nor defiance. Eventually, he walked back to his cabin and told Ingrid that the Russian woman was either touched in the head or did not understand English well enough to know what he had said. Either way, they would be burying her come spring. Ingrid was kinder about it. She baked a loaf of bread and filled a jar with preserves from the previous summer, and she walked out to Elena's claim the next day to deliver them. A welcome gift, the kind of gesture that neighbor women made for each other on the frontier, where isolation could kill you as surely as cold or hunger. Elena accepted the gifts with what seemed like genuine gratitude. She thanked Ingrid in her broken English. She invited her inside the canvas tent where she was living while she built her permanent home. But Ingrid noticed the drawings spread out on Elena's makeshift table, the strange diagrams with their horizontal lines and their cramped notations, and she asked what they were. Elena tried to explain. She spoke slowly, searching for words, gesturing with her hands. Something about heat, something about the earth, something about her grandfather back in Russia, who had built stoves that kept whole families warm through winters, that made Dakota look gentle. Ingrid nodded and smiled and did not understand a word of it. But the look in her eyes when she walked back home to Gunnar said the same thing he had already said. The Russian woman was not going to make it. The other neighbors agreed. Wilhelm Brauer, who had homesteaded a section to the east, was a German from Saxony, 53 years old. He had built 17 houses back in Milwaukee before the financial panic of '73 wiped him out and sent him west looking for a fresh start. He understood masonry. He understood thermal dynamics. He understood the principles by which heat moved through enclosed spaces, and when Elena showed him her grandfather's drawings, he understood that she was making a fatal mistake. The problem is surface area, he told her, speaking slowly the way people did when they thought you might not understand English. He had come to her claim in October after word spread through the small community of homesteaders that the Russian woman was building something strange beside the river. Hot air rises. That is physics. That is God's law. You are forcing smoke to travel horizontal through cold earth. You will lose heat at every turn. A straight chimney pulls hard, creates draft, burns clean. Your system fights itself. Elena did not argue with him either. She simply asked a question. How much wood you burn yesterday? Wilhelm frowned. I do not keep count of every piece of wood. I burn 1/4 cord per week, Elena said. Since September. How much you burn, Wilhelm did not answer, but Gunnar would later admit that he had burned 7 cords by Christmas and Wilhelm's cabin was only slightly larger than Gunnar's, built the same way, with the same supposedly efficient chimney design. Patrick Brennan was the third neighbor to offer his assessment. He was Irish, 41 years old, a former railroad worker who had laid track for the Northern Pacific from Minnesota to Montana before taking up a homestead claim along the river bottom. He had survived the Battle of Antietam back in '62. He had seen men die from wounds and disease and cold, and he had learned to recognize the signs of someone who was not going to make it. Something in the eyes, something in the way they moved through the world, already half absent, already on their way to wherever the dead went. Elena Volkov had none of those signs, but that did not mean she was going to survive. Patrick spent 2 hours one afternoon in August trying to talk her out of her building plan. He sat on an overturned bucket and watched her work, watched her haul stones up from the river in a borrowed wagon, watched her chip and shape limestone with tools she had bought on credit from Schroeder's Mercantile in Grafton, and he explained everything that was wrong with what she was doing. That fire will not draw right, he said. Smoke will back up and you will suffocate in your sleep. I have seen it happen. Railroad camps in Montana, men building stoves they did not understand dead by morning with their lungs full of carbon. It is an ugly way to go. Elena did not stop working while he talked. She fitted another stone into place, checked its alignment with a level she had made from a glass bottle filled with water, adjusted it slightly, and moved on to the next one. In Saratov, she said, not looking up, my grandfather heat house with one fire, burn in morning, warm all day, all night. This is not Russia, Patrick said. No, Elena agreed, is colder. Patrick had no response to that. He sat on his bucket and watched her work until the sun started going down, and then he walked back to his own cabin and told himself that he had done what he could. Some people could not be saved. Some people had to learn their lessons the hard way, assuming they lived long enough to learn anything at all. The Reverend Holmgren was the last to weigh in. He led services every other Sunday in Gunnar's barn, reading from a Swedish Bible his parents had brought over from the old country, offering what spiritual comfort he could to a community scattered across dozens of square miles of empty prairie. He was a kind man, genuinely concerned for the souls and bodies of his small congregation. And when he heard about the Russian woman building a home that seemed designed to kill her, he felt obligated to intervene. He rode out to her claim on a September afternoon, his horse picking its way along the faint trail that led down toward the river. What he found surprised him. The dugout was nearly finished. It descended 4 feet into the earth and stretched 20 feet long by 14 feet wide. The roof was cottonwood logs layered with sod, making the whole structure nearly invisible from 100 yards off. Just a low mound with a door on the south face and a stovepipe that rose only 3 feet above ground level. Inside, he found something even stranger. A firebox built from river rock sitting in the northwest corner. But instead of a chimney rising straight up, he saw a series of horizontal channels running through the floor, snaking back and forth beneath the packed earth in a pattern he had never encountered in 30 years of ministry across 3 states. The channels were constructed from flat limestone she had split herself, fitted tight enough that smoke could not escape, but loose enough that heat could radiate through. They ran for 43 feet total, doubling back on themselves 4 times before finally rising through a vertical shaft that exited just 18 inches above the roofline. The Reverend Holmgren did not understand what he was looking at, but he understood danger when he saw it, and he understood his duty to those who might be led astray. A woman alone, he said gently, might find better prospects back in Minneapolis. There is no shame in recognizing when a situation is beyond our capabilities. The Lord helps those who help themselves, but he also gave us the wisdom to know when we need help from others. Elena listened to his words with the same calm attention she had shown to everyone else. And when he finished, she thanked him for his concern. She offered him water from her spring. She showed him the icon of Saint Seraphim that hung near her sleeping platform, suggesting a faith that might align with his own, even if her church and his church had diverged many centuries ago. But she did not change her plans. She did not abandon her dugout. She did not seek better prospects in Minneapolis or anywhere else. The Reverend rode away convinced that he had done what he could, like Patrick, like Wilhelm, like Gunnar. All of them had offered their wisdom and their warnings, and all of them had been politely, quietly, stubbornly ignored. The neighbors were not mean-spirited about it. Not exactly. They were people who had survived the first terrible winter of 73 to 74, when the cold had killed half the cattle in the territory and when families had burned their own furniture to stay alive. They had learned hard lessons about survival on the northern plains, and they genuinely believed Elena was making a fatal mistake. But there was something else beneath their concern, something they might not have admitted even to themselves. A woman alone filing a claim, building a home, surviving without a husband or father or brother to provide for her. It was not how things were supposed to work. It was not the natural order. And if she succeeded, if she proved that a woman could survive alone on the frontier, then what did that say about the way they had always done things? Better that she fail. Better that she serve as an example, a cautionary tale, a reminder that the old ways were the right ways and that those who departed from them paid the price. They waited for winter to prove them right. Elena kept building. By the end of August, the structure was complete. By the middle of September, she had finished the heating system, all 43 feet of limestone, channels embedded in 6 tons of thermal mass clay and river sand mixed with cut straw packed tight beneath her floor. The system was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It looked like something a child might draw, all those channels running back and forth, all those turns and corners that seemed to defy the basic logic of how smoke should travel. But it was finished. And on September 3rd, 1874, Elena Volkov lit a fire in her new home for the first time. The morning was cool, 49 degrees outside, a hint of the call that was coming, the cold that would descend in November and not release its grip until April. Elena built her fire, carefully arranging dry cottonwood and twisted hay in the firebox, leaving room for air to circulate, creating the conditions for a clean, hot burn that would send maximum heat into the channels beneath her floor. She lit the match. The kindling caught. The flames grew, and smoke began to pour back into the room. For a long moment, Elena just watched. Smoke curled from the firebox, filled the dugout, stung her eyes, and scratched at her throat. Anyone watching would have said that Patrick Brennan had been right, that the system did not draw properly, that she had built herself a death trap. But Elena did not panic. She did not throw open the door and flee into the morning air. Instead, she moved to the sheet iron damper she had fashioned and installed in the main channel just past the firebox, and she adjusted it. A quarter turn, then another. Watching the smoke, reading its movement the way a sailor reads the wind. The draft caught. She could see it happen. The smoke hesitated, swirled, and then reversed direction. Instead of pouring into the room, it began to pull toward the channel, sucked along by the rising heat in the vertical shaft at the far end of the system. Within seconds, the air in the dugout was clear. Within minutes, the system was working exactly as her grandfather's drawings had promised it would work. Elena closed the damper partway, reducing the draft to a level that would maximize heat transfer through the channels. She added more wood to the fire, building it up to a steady burn. Then she sat down on her sleeping platform and waited. 1 hour passed. The packed earth beneath her feet grew warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just warm like sun-heated stone on a summer afternoon. The warmth radiated upward, filling the dugout with a gentle, even heat that bore no resemblance to the harsh blast of a traditional fireplace. 2 hours passed. The temperature inside the dugout rose to 68 degrees. Outside, it was still 49. A differential of nearly 20 degrees maintained by a fire that was already burning down to coals. 3 hours passed. The fire died. Just coals now glowing red in the firebox, not enough to produce any new heat. But the temperature inside the dugout continued to rise. 70 degrees. 72 degrees. The thermal mass beneath the floor had absorbed heat for 3 hours, and now it was releasing that heat back into the air, slowly, steadily, like a stone pulled from a campfire and wrapped in blankets to warm a bed. Elena let the coals die completely. She did not add more wood. She simply waited, checking the thermometer every hour, recording the readings in a small notebook she kept beside her sleeping platform. When she woke the next morning, 10 hours after the last flame had flickered out, the temperature inside her dugout was still 68 degrees. Outside, it was 49. The system worked. It worked because it was designed to work, because her grandfather had understood principles of thermal dynamics that most American builders had never encountered, because generations of Russian peasants had learned through centuries of trial and error that the way to survive a continental winter was not to fight the cold with constant fire, but to store heat in mass and release it slowly, turning your home into a battery that stayed charged for hours after the flames went out. The horizontal channels maximized heat transfer. Every turn, every corner, every foot of limestone surface area was an opportunity for heat to move from the smoke into the surrounding mass. A straight chimney sent that heat directly into the sky. Elena's system trapped it, held it, released it only after extracting every possible degree of warmth. The buried design protected against wind. A chimney standing tall above a roofline was a target for every gust that swept across the plains. Wind could blow down a chimney, reversing the draft, filling a cabin with smoke and ash. Elena's exit shaft, rising only 18 inches above ground levels, was too low to catch the wind, too protected by the mounded earth to suffer from the gusts that made traditional chimneys liabilities in a storm. The thermal mass evened out temperature swings. A traditional fireplace produced intense heat when burning and no heat when cold. You roasted when the fire was high and froze when it died. Elena's system produced moderate, steady warmth that varied only a few degrees over 24 hours. Comfortable to sleep in, comfortable to work in, comfortable in a way that traditional heating could never match. And the whole thing burned a quarter cord of wood per week. Gunnar Torvalds would burn 7 cords by Christmas. Wilhelm Brouwer would burn nearly as much. Patrick Brennan, in a smaller cabin, would still burn 4 cords in the same period. Elena would burn 1 cord total September through December, and her home would be warmer than any of theirs. Word spread through the small community of homesteaders that the Russian woman's strange heating system seemed to be working. Wilhelm Brouwer heard about it first from Reverend Holmgren, who had stopped by Elena's dugout in early October and found her comfortable in a light dress, no shawl, no heavy clothing, while the temperature outside hovered in the low 40s. Wilhelm did not believe it. He was a man who had built 17 houses, who understood masonry and thermal dynamics, who knew the principles by which heat moved through enclosed spaces. What the Reverend described was not possible. It violated physics. It violated everything Wilhelm knew about how the world worked. So he went to see for himself. He stood in Elena's dugout on an October afternoon, hat in his hands, speaking slowly and carefully, as if to a child who might not understand. He looked at the firebox. He looked at the channels running beneath the floor. He looked at the low exit shaft and the sheet iron damper and the 6 tons of thermal mass packed tight beneath the packed earth. And he did not understand what he was looking at. The problem is surface area, he said again, repeating the argument he had made a month earlier. You are forcing smoke to travel horizontal through cold earth. You lose heat at every turn. A straight chimney pulls hard, creates draft, burns clean. Your system fights itself, Elena did not argue. She simply asked him to calculate. Floor is 43 feet of channel, she said. Smoke touch stone all way through. Stone get hot, stone stay hot. Chimney pulls smoke out at end. What is problem? Wilhelm did not answer immediately. He was doing the math in his head, calculating surface area, calculating heat transfer rates, calculating the thermal capacity of 6 tons of mass compared to the thin walls of a traditional chimney. The numbers did not make sense. The numbers said that Elena's system should be roughly 3 times more efficient than a conventional design. Maybe more. How much wood you burn yesterday? Elena asked. Wilhelm still did not answer. I burn 1/4 cord per week, Elena said. Since September. How much you burn? He left without saying anything else. He walked back to his own cabin, where his own chimney rose straight and true toward the sky, where his own fire was burning through wood at a rate that would exhaust his supply before spring if he did not cut more soon. That night, Wilhelm Brouwer could not sleep. He lay in his bed next to his wife in a cabin that was 57 degrees, despite the fire he had been feeding all day, and he did the calculations again. Surface area, heat transfer, thermal mass, draft requirements. All the variables he had learned in 40 years of building, all the principles he had been taught by men who had been taught by other men going back generations. The numbers said Elena was right. The numbers said her system should work exactly as she claimed, roughly 340% more efficient than a conventional design, which meant she could burn one log where Wilhelm burned three, which meant she could heat her home for a week on the wood he went through in 2 days. 340%. It was not possible. It could not be right. Elena was an immigrant woman who barely spoke English, who had no formal training in building or engineering or any of the disciplines that Wilhelm had spent his life mastering. She could not know more than he did. She could not have built something better than what he had built. And yet the numbers said she had. Wilhelm stared at the ceiling of his cabin and listened to the wind outside and felt the cold creeping in through walls that suddenly seemed poorly designed, through a chimney that suddenly seemed like a flaw rather than a feature. He thought about the 17 houses he had built in Milwaukee. He thought about all the families who had lived in those houses, who had burned wood and coal through long Wisconsin winters, who had assumed that the way Wilhelm built things was the best way to build things because Wilhelm was an expert and experts knew best. What if he had been wrong? What if there was a better way and he had simply never encountered it? Wilhelm did not sleep at all that night, and in the morning he still did not have an answer. The winter of 1874 to 75 arrived in November, and it arrived hard. Temperatures dropped below zero in the second week and stayed there with occasional dips to 20 and 30 below for most of the next 4 months. Snow fell in quantities that buried fence posts and drifted against cabin walls, creating white mountains that had to be shoveled clear every morning to keep doors from being blocked entirely. Gunnar Torvalds burned wood, Wilhelm Brauer burned wood, Patrick Brennan burned wood, the Reverend Holmgren burned wood. Every homesteader in Pembina County burned wood as fast as they could cut it, struggling to stay ahead of the cold rationing their supplies, wondering if they would make it to spring. Elena Volkov burned 1/4 cord per week. Her dugout stayed warm, not hot, not uncomfortable, just warm 70 degrees or so, varying by only a few degrees no matter what the temperature did outside. She tended her fire each morning, burning for 2 or 3 hours, letting the thermal mass absorb heat, then letting the fire die and living on stored warmth for the rest of the day and night. She did not suffer. She did not freeze. She did not burn furniture or ration food or wonder if she would survive. She simply waited. The neighbors watched from a distance. They saw smoke rising from her low chimney each morning, thin and sparse, nothing like the billowing columns that poured from their own homes. They saw her walking to the spring for water, dressed in layers but not shivering, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who had plenty of energy because she was not spending all of it fighting the cold. They did not understand. Maybe she is burning buffalo chips, Gunnar suggested to his wife one evening. Or dried cow manure, something that makes less smoke. Buffalo chips do not heat a home, Ingrid replied. You know that. Then she has found coal somewhere. Or she is lying about how much wood she burns. Why would she lie? Gunnar did not have an answer. He just knew that what Elena claimed could not be true, because if it were true, then everything he knew about building and heating and surviving on the frontier was wrong. And Gunnar Torvalds was not a man who enjoyed being wrong. The winter passed. Elena survived. The neighbors noticed, but they explained it away. Mild winter, some of them said, though it was nothing of the kind. Lucky, others suggested, though luck had nothing to do with it. Beginner's fortune, a few concluded, implying that next winter would be different, that next winter would teach her the lessons she had somehow escaped learning this time around. They waited for the next winter to prove them right. They were going to wait a long time. The spring of 1875 came late to Pembina County. Ice did not break on the Tongue River until the third week of April, and snow lingered in shaded hollows well into May. But it came eventually, the way spring always comes, and with it came the planting season and the work that filled every waking hour from dawn to dusk. Elena Volkov planted wheat on her quarter section. She borrowed a plow from Patrick Brennan and a mule from Wilhelm Brauer, paying for both with labor, helping Patrick repair his fence line and helping Wilhelm's wife with the spring cleaning. She worked the black loam soil that had drawn her to this particular piece of land, turning furrows that stretched straight and true across the prairie, dropping seed by hand because she could not afford a mechanical planter. The neighbors watched her work. They had expected her to leave after the first winter to give up her claim and head back to Minneapolis, or wherever else failed homesteaders went. But she had not left. She had survived. And now she was planting, putting down roots in a literal sense, making it clear that she intended to stay. Gunnar Torvalds did not know what to make of it. He had been so certain she would die, so confident in his prediction, that he had already calculated which parts of her claim he might acquire when she abandoned it. The quarter section along the river bend, with its cottonwoods and its spring, would make excellent pasture land. He had pictured his cattle drinking from that spring, grazing in the shade of those trees, fattening on grass that should have belonged to a dead Russian woman. But she was not dead. She was planting wheat. The summer passed in a blur of work and heat and the endless battle against weeds and insects and all the other enemies that threatened a crop between planting and harvest. Elena's wheat grew tall and golden, swaying in the prairie wind like waves on an inland sea. She harvested it in September, cutting by hand with a scythe she had sharpened, herself binding sheaves and stacking them in shocks to dry. The yield was modest, maybe 15 bushels per acre, but it was enough. Enough to sell, enough to buy supplies for the coming winter, enough to prove that she could not only survive on this land, but prosper. The second winter arrived in early November, and it was harder than the first. Temperatures dropped to 30 below in December and stayed there for weeks. Blizzards swept across the plains with a frequency that kept everyone trapped inside for days at a time. The snow accumulated in drifts that reached the rooflines of some cabins, burying the landscape under a white blanket so thick and so bright that it hurt the eyes to look at it. Gunnar burned wood, 8 cords by Christmas, this time more than the previous year because the cold was deeper and the storms were worse. His chimney worked as well as it ever had, pulling smoke straight up toward the sky, but it also pulled heat, sending warmth billowing out into the frozen air above his roof, while his family huddled close to the fire and shivered. Wilhelm burned wood. His German engineering, his carefully designed heating system, with its water jacket and circulating pipes, consumed fuel at a rate that exhausted his winter supply by February. He spent 2 weeks in a march cutting green wood from a stand of oaks 3 miles to the west, dragging it home on a sledge, burning it wet because he had no choice, filling his cabin with smoke that made his wife cough and his children cry. Patrick burned wood. His small cabin required less fuel than the larger homes, but he still went through 4 cords by Christmas, another 3 by the end of February, rationing carefully, never quite warm, never quite comfortable, always aware of the stack outside his door shrinking day by day. Elena burned 1/4 cord per week, the same as the year before, the same as her system was designed to burn. She tended her morning fire, loaded the channels with heat, let the thermal mass do its work, and spent her days in a dugout that stayed 70 degrees while the world outside froze solid. The neighbors could no longer pretend they did not notice. They could no longer explain it away as luck, or lies, or some trick of accounting. Elena was burning a fraction of what they burned, and she was warmer than any of them. The numbers did not lie. The thermometer did not lie. Something was happening in that buried home by the river, something that worked better than anything they had built, or anything their fathers had built, or anything the books from Chicago and Philadelphia said was possible. Wilhelm Brauer thought about it constantly. He had done the calculations so many times that he could recite them from memory. Surface area, heat transfer, thermal mass, draft efficiency. Every variable pointed to the same conclusion. Elena's system was superior, not marginally superior, not slightly better, roughly 340% more efficient than conventional design. But knowing the numbers and accepting them were different things. Wilhelm had spent his entire adult life building houses a certain way, teaching others to build houses a certain way, believing that the way he did things was the right way because it was the way things had always been done. To accept that Elena was right meant accepting that he had been wrong. For 40 years, for 17 houses, for countless families who had burned more wood than they needed to burn, who had been colder than they needed to be because Wilhelm Brauer had not known what a Russian peasant woman knew. He was not ready to accept that. Not yet. The winter ground on. February passed into March into April. The ice broke on the river. The snow began to melt. And when the homesteaders of Pembina County emerged from their cabins to assess the damage and count their losses, they found that everyone had survived, but not everyone had thrived. Gunnar's children had suffered frostbite on their toes during a particularly cold week in January. Not severe enough to require amputation, but enough to cause pain and swelling that lasted for months. His youngest boy would walk with a slight limp for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of nights when the fire could not keep up with the cold. Wilhelm's wife had developed a persistent cough from the smoke of burning green wood. It would fade over the summer, but return each winter for the rest of her life, a chronic irritation that reminded her every day of the winter when they had run out of fuel. Patrick had made it through in relatively good shape, but he had lost weight, his body consuming itself to generate heat when the fire could not provide enough. He looked gaunt and hollow when he emerged in spring, a man who had aged 5 years in 5 months. Elena looked the same as she had in the fall, maybe a little paler from spending so much time underground, but healthy, well-fed, well-rested. She had not suffered. She had not struggled. She had simply waited out the winter in a home that worked the way homes were supposed to work. The contrast was impossible to ignore. And yet the neighbors continued to ignore it because the alternative was admitting that they had been wrong, and admitting you were wrong was hard, and admitting that an immigrant woman knew more than you did was harder still. Another summer passed, another harvest, another autumn of preparation for the cold that everyone knew was coming. And then it was January of 1876 and everything changed. Elena woke before dawn on the morning of January 9th. She did not know why. Nothing had disturbed her sleep. No sound, no movement, no obvious reason to open her eyes in the darkness of her dugout while the world outside was still black and silent. But something had woken her, some instinct that lived beneath conscious thought, and she lay in her bed for a long moment listening. The silence was wrong. She could not have explained what she meant by that. The silence of a winter night was always deep, always profound, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears like cotton. But this silence had a weight to it, a pressure, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Elena rose and dressed in the darkness, lighting her oil lamp only after she had pulled on her boots and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She climbed the 4 steps that led from her dugout to the surface and pushed open the door that faced south, the door that served as an airlock against the wind. The sky stopped her. She had seen many skies in her 32 years. The vast blue dome over the Volga, stretching from horizon to horizon across the steppes. The gray canopy of the North Atlantic pressing down on the ship that had carried her to America. The endless prairie sky of Dakota, bigger than any sky she had ever seen, a bowl of blue so large it seemed to curve at the edges. But she had never seen a sky like this. The stars were gone. All of them. The pre-dawn darkness should have been speckled with light, with Orion and the Dippers and all the familiar constellations that guided travelers and farmers and sailors. But there was nothing, just blackness, absolute and complete, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the heavens. And in the west, barely visible against that blackness, there was something else. A wall, a mass, a presence that blocked out the stars where it touched the horizon and rose upward toward the zenith, higher and higher, eating the sky as it came. Elena had seen clouds like this before. Once, in Saratov when she was 12 years old, when a storm had come down from Siberia and killed half the cattle in the oblast. Her grandfather had seen it coming, had recognized the signs, had gathered the family into the house with the Pechka stove and told them not to open the door for any reason until he said it was safe. That storm had lasted 3 days. When it ended, the snow had drifted higher than the roof and the temperature had dropped so low that metal tools cracked when you tried to use them. This storm looked worse. Elena did not panic. She did not run to warn her neighbors. She did not waste time on things that could not be changed. Instead, she began to prepare. She walked to the spring first while the air was still calm, while the temperature was merely 18 below, instead of whatever it would become when that wall of darkness arrived. She filled every vessel she owned, 2 wooden barrels she had bought from Patrick Brennan, a collection of clay jugs and metal pots, a wash tub that she dragged through the snow, sloshing water over the sides with every step. The spring was fed from underground from deep beneath the frost line, and it ran clear and cold year-round. Elena knew that it would continue to run even in the worst cold, but she also knew that getting to it might become impossible if the storm was bad enough. Better to have water inside, better to have everything inside. She hauled wood next. Her winter supply was stacked in the narrow entry tunnel that led down to her dugout, protected from snow and wind, but she added more anyway. Enough for 2 weeks, maybe 3. She did not know how long the storm would last, and she did not want to find out the hard way that she had not prepared enough. She checked her food stores. 43 pounds of potatoes in a storage pit beneath the northeast corner of her floor insulated by earth and kept just above freezing by the residual warmth of her heating system. 27 pounds of salt pork hanging from the roof beams. 6 pounds of cornmeal in a sealed tin. Dried beans, dried peas. A small wheel of cheese she had traded labor for at the Torvalds' place back in the fall. It was enough. Enough for weeks. Maybe months if she was careful. The sun rose while she worked, though rose was perhaps too strong a word. The light increased, gray and diffuse, filtered through the advancing wall of cloud that had swallowed half the sky since she first saw it. The temperature did not rise with the light. If anything, it dropped, the cold deepening as the storm approached, as if the darkness itself was breathing out winter. Gunnar Torvalds saw her working from the window of his cabin. He watched her hauling water and wood, making trip after trip from the spring and the woodpile to her dugout, moving with a purpose that seemed excessive for a January morning that was cold but not exceptional. "She is preparing for something," Ingrid said, standing beside him at the window. "She is always preparing for something." Gunnar shook his head. "The Russian woman. She acts like the world is ending every time a cloud appears. That is a large cloud." Gunnar looked at the sky. He had noticed the darkness in the west, but he had not thought much of it. Clouds were clouds. Storms were storms. You built your fire and waited them out, and life continued. That was how it worked on the prairie. That was how it had always worked. "It is just winter," he called across the frozen ground, loud enough for Elena to hear if she was listening. "You act like the world is ending." Elena did not respond. She did not even look up. She just continued hauling wood, stacking it in her entry tunnel, preparing for something that Gunnar could not see and did not believe in. By noon, the wall of cloud had swallowed 3/4 of the sky. The temperature had dropped from 18 below to 26 below. The barometer in Patrick Brennan's cabin, a brass instrument he had bought in St. Paul before heading west, had been falling for 18 hours straight. Patrick noticed. He was not a man who paid much attention to instruments, preferring to read the weather in the behavior of animals, in the feel of the air. But when a barometer fell for 18 hours, when the mercury dropped from 30 inches to 28 and showed no signs of stopping, even a man who trusted his instincts more than his instruments had to take notice. He thought about riding out to warn the others. Gunnar, Wilhelm, the Reverend Holmgren, the other homesteaders scattered across the county. But the wind was already rising, gusts that cut through his coat and stung his face, and the sky was wrong, and something in his gut told him that there was no time. No time to warn anyone. No time to do anything except prepare. He hauled water, he hauled wood, he checked his food stores, and he watched the sky, watched the wall of darkness advance across the prairie, and he felt something he had not felt since Antietam. Fear. Not the ordinary fear of a man facing a hard winter. Not the practical fear of running out of food or fuel. This was something deeper, something older. The kind of fear that lived in the bones and the blood, in the ancient parts of the brain that remembered when humans were prey instead of predators. Something was coming. Something big. Something that would test everything he knew about survival and find out whether it was enough. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun disappeared entirely. Not behind a cloud, not in a gradual dimming. It simply vanished, swallowed by the darkness that had consumed the sky, leaving a twilight gloom that made it impossible to tell day from night. At 4 o'clock, the temperature dropped to 34 below. At 6 o'clock, it dropped to 38 below. At midnight, it dropped to 43 below zero. And at 2 in the morning on January 12, 1876, the wind arrived. It came with a sound like freighted trains colliding, like the earth itself was tearing apart. Like all the forces of nature that usually held themselves in check had decided at the same moment to let loose everything they had. 57 miles per hour, gusting to 65. Carrying snow so fine and so cold that it penetrated gaps in construction that had not existed before, prying between logs, finding its way through supposedly solid walls, filling the air with white that moved and shifted like something alive. The Lakota people called storms like this Wanatu Watakia, the winter that takes everything. They had seen them before once or twice a generation, storms so severe that entire herds of buffalo died standing up, frozen in place, still on their feet. They had learned to fear these storms the way sensible people fear earthquakes and floods and all the other disasters that remind humanity of its smallness. The homesteaders of Pembina County had never seen anything like it. They had survived hard winters. They had endured cold that would have killed men in gentler climates. But they had never experienced a storm that combined temperature and wind and duration in a way that made survival a matter of feet and minutes rather than miles and hours. Gunnar Torvalds discovered this within the first hour. His chimney, that straight and efficient chimney, he was so proud of the chimney his father had built, and his father's father had built back in Norway, became a liability as soon as the wind reached full strength. The gusts found the chimney opening. They roared down it. They blew smoke and ash back into the cabin with such force that the fire itself seemed to explode, sending sparks and coals scattering across the floor, filling the room with a choking gray fog that made breathing impossible. Gunnar threw open the door to clear the smoke, and the wind knocked him backward. It hit him like a physical blow, like a fist made of ice, driving him into the room and slamming the door behind him with a force that cracked the frame. The temperature inside the cabin dropped 10 degrees in the seconds that the door was open. He had no choice. He closed the damper. He let the fire die. He let the coals cool to ash while his family huddled together under every blanket they owned, while the temperature inside the cabin dropped from 58 degrees to 50 degrees to 40 degrees to 39 degrees in a matter of hours. The walls creaked. The wind screamed. The snow found its way through gaps that Gunnar had caulked and sealed and checked a dozen times, forming little drifts in the corners of the room on the windowsill along the crack beneath the door that supposedly fit tight in its frame. His children cried. Ingrid held them close, wrapping them in her own body, heat sacrificing her own warmth to keep them alive. Gunnar paced the cabin, thinking, calculating, trying to figure out how to restart the fire without letting the wind blow it back in his face, without filling the room with smoke again, without making things worse instead of better. He could not find a solution. The wind was too strong. The chimney was too exposed. Every principle of construction he had learned, every technique his father had taught him, every assumption he had made about how to build a home on the frontier had failed him. He watched the thermometer drop. 38 degrees inside, then 35, then 32. The temperature at which water froze. The temperature at which exposed flesh began to die. 170 yards to the east, Wilhelm Brauer was fighting a different battle. His chimney drew. That was the problem. It drew too well. The wind created a Venturi effect, a vacuum that pulled air through the firebox at 3 times the normal rate. His fire roared like a furnace, consuming wood faster than he had ever seen wood consumed, burning through his carefully rationed supply at a pace that would exhaust it in 4 days if the storm lasted that long. He fed the fire desperately. Log after log, hour after hour. He did not dare let it die because restarting it in this wind would be nearly impossible. And without fire, his family would freeze just as surely as Gunnar's family was freezing. The choice was between burning through all his fuel and hoping the storm ended before he ran out, or saving his fuel and freezing to death in the meantime. He chose to burn. His cabin stayed warm. 52 degrees. Not comfortable, but survivable. But the woodpile outside his door shrank visibly with every passing hour. 20 logs became 15. 15 became 10. 10 became 5. And the storm showed no sign of stopping. Patrick Brennan had built his cabin smaller than the others, partly due to limited resources, and partly due to hard-won wisdom about heat and space. A smaller cabin needed less fuel. A smaller space stayed warmer with less fire. He had learned this lesson in railroad camps, where men lived in canvas tents and sheet metal shanties, and survived by understanding the relationship between volume and temperature. His chimney drew well enough to keep the fire burning, but not so well that it consumed fuel at Wilhelm's impossible rate. He was burning wood fast, maybe twice his normal consumption, but he had enough. Barely. If the storm lasted less than a week, he would make it. But the wind found other ways to hurt him. It drove cold through the walls despite every precaution he had taken. It created drafts that stole heat from the air even as the fire produced it. The temperature in his cabin hovered around 45 degrees, warm enough to survive, but cold enough to hurt. He felt the cold in his feet first, a numbness that started in his toes and crept upward toward his ankles. He stamped and walked and rubbed his feet with his hands trying to restore circulation, but the cold was relentless, patient wearing him down hour by hour while the storm raged outside. By the second day, he could not feel his left foot at all. 300 yards south in a dugout carved into the earth beside the frozen bend of the Tongue River, Elena Volkov sat reading a German Bible by the light of her oil lamp. The thermometer on her wall read 71 degrees. She had lit her fire at dawn on January 11th, the morning before the storm hit. Just 2 hours of burning, a careful arrangement of dry cottonwood that heated the thermal mass beneath her floor. By the time the wind arrived, she had let the fire die to coals, adding just enough fuel to maintain a gentle, steady heat. The storm could not reach her chimney. The exit shaft rose only 18 inches above ground level, protected by the mounded earth that formed her roof. Snow had already drifted over it, leaving only a small hole that drew just enough air to keep the coals alive. The wind could not penetrate her walls. She was underground, surrounded by 4 feet of earth on every side, insulated by the weight and mass of the prairie itself. The temperature outside could drop to 50 below and she would barely notice. The horizontal channels beneath her floor had absorbed heat for 15 hours before the temperature dropped to killing levels. Now they were releasing it back slowly, steadily, turning the packed earth into a radiant heating panel that warmed the air without burning through her limited fuel supply. She burned 1/8 of a cord during the entire first day of the storm. Gunnar, if he had been able to keep his fire lit, would have burned 2 full cords to achieve the same warmth. Elena did not know this. She did not know that her neighbors were freezing while she sat comfortable in her shirt sleeves. She could not hear the storm clearly through 4 feet of earth and 2 feet of sod. She could not see the snow piling in drifts that would bury cabins to their eaves. She only knew that her system worked, that her grandfather's knowledge had proven true, that she was warm and safe while the worst storm in a generation raged overhead. She spent the days doing handwork by lamplight, mending clothes, braiding rope from dried grass, reading from the German Bible that Reverend Holmgren had loaned her, puzzling out the Gothic script with its unfamiliar letters, finding comfort in words that transcended language and nationality and all the barriers that separated people from each other. She slept well. She ate well. She did not worry. The storm lasted 4 days. On the 3rd day, Gunnar Torvalds made a decision that almost killed him. His woodpile was gone. Every log, every stick, every piece of kindling he had gathered and split and stacked against the winter. He had burned it all, trying to keep his family alive, and now there was nothing left, and the storm was still howling, and the temperature inside his cabin had dropped to 39 degrees, and his children were showing white patches on their toes despite sleeping in all the clothes they owned. He needed fuel. Wilhelm's cabin was 170 yards to the east. Wilhelm had more wood. Wilhelm always had more wood because Wilhelm was German, and Germans planned ahead. And if Gunnar could get there, if he could borrow or buy or beg enough fuel to last another day, his family might survive. It was a terrible plan. He knew it was a terrible plan even as he formulated it. 170 yards was nothing in normal weather. He had walked that distance 1,000 times. But this was not normal weather. This was Wanatu Watakia. This was the winter that takes everything. But he had no other options. Stay and freeze, or go and maybe freeze, or go and maybe live. When those were your choices, you went. He tied a rope around his waist. 40 feet of hemp line anchored to the door handle of his cabin, the only connection he would have to home once he stepped outside. He wrapped his face in scarves until only his eyes were visible. He put on every piece of clothing he owned, layer after layer, wool and cotton and leather, until he could barely move his arms. And then he opened the door and stepped out into hell. The wind hit him immediately. Not a gust, not a push. A solid wall of force that knocked him sideways, that would have knocked him down if he had not braced for it, that drove ice crystals into the tiny gap between his scarves with such force that they drew blood. He could not see. Not 10 feet. Not 5 feet. Not even his own hand when he raised it in front of his face. The world was white and gray and howling, a chaos of snow and wind that had no up or down, no direction, no reference point of any kind. He started walking. East. Toward Wilhelm's cabin. Toward warmth and fuel and survival. He counted his steps. 10, 20, 30. The rope unspooling behind him, his only connection to home, his only guarantee that he could find his way back if he failed. 40 steps. 47 steps. His legs were burning with cold. His lungs were burning with air so frigid that it hurt to breathe. He stopped. Something was wrong. He could not say what, but something was wrong. The rope should have been tighter. He should have felt resistance from the anchor point. But the rope was slack in his hands, running out behind him without tension, without feedback, without any indication of where he had been or where he was going. He turned around, or he thought he turned around. In the white chaos of the storm, direction had lost all meaning. He pulled on the rope, trying to follow it back, but the rope coiled and tangled, and he could not tell which way it led. Panic. Real panic. The kind that stops thought and floods the body with chemicals that demand action even when action is impossible. Gunnar pulled on the rope desperately, hand over hand, not knowing which direction he was going, not knowing if he was heading toward home or away from it, knowing only that he had to move, had to do something, had to fight against the storm that was trying to kill him. The rope saved his life. 40 feet of hemp line anchored to the door handle of his cabin, tangled and confusing but ultimately traceable back to its source. He followed it, not by sight because there was no sight, not by direction because there was no direction, just by feel, hand over hand, pulling himself through the snow, crawling the last 10 feet on his hands and knees because the wind was too strong to stand. He found the door. He found the handle. He pulled himself inside and collapsed on the floor while Ingrid screamed and the children cried and the wind howled through the open door before he managed to kick it shut. He had been outside for maybe 10 minutes. He had traveled maybe 47 feet from his cabin. He had nearly died. His face was bloody from ice crystals driven through the caps in his scarves. His fingers were white to the second knuckle, the flesh already dead, frostbite setting in despite the gloves and the layers and all the protection he had thought would be enough. Ingrid wept when she saw him. She stripped off his gloves and his scarves and his outer layers, rubbing his hands with her own, trying to restore circulation, trying to bring color back to fingers that had turned the color of old snow. And Gunnar lying on the floor of his cabin, his face bloody and his hands frozen and his family huddled around him in the 39-degree air, understood something he had never understood before. This was not Norway. This was not Wisconsin. This was not any place he had ever been or any winter he had ever survived. The rules were different here. The margins were smaller. The cold was not an inconvenience to be endured, but an enemy to be fought, and he had been fighting it with the wrong weapons. He had nearly died 47 feet from his own door. 47 feet. On the fourth day, Patrick Brennan performed surgery on himself. His left foot had turned black. Not the pale white of frostbite, but the dark purple black of dead tissue of flesh that had frozen and would never recover. He had tried to save it. He had rubbed it and warmed it and elevated it and prayed over it, but the cold had been too deep and too long, and by the third day he knew. The toes were dead. If he left them attached, the rot would spread. The gangrene would climb his leg poison. His blood kill him as surely as the cold would have killed him if he had not kept his fire burning. He had seen this before. In the army, after Antietam. Men with wounds that had festered, men with limbs that had turned black, men who lived because surgeons had cut away the dead flesh before it could kill them. He knew what had to be done. He did not want to do it, but wanting had nothing to do with it. He heated his knife in the fire until the blade glowed red. He found a piece of leather to bite on the same piece of leather he had used to strap down wounded soldiers in field hospitals 13 years ago. He propped his foot on a stool where he could see it clearly. 3 toes on the left foot, the smallest 3. Dead at the base, the joints visible through the blackened skin. He cut. The pain was extraordinary, even through the numbness of the dead tissue. Pain in the living flesh that surrounded the dead. Pain as the knife sliced through skin and tendon and the small bones that connected toes to foot. Pain that he absorbed without screaming, because screaming would use energy, and energy was something he could not afford to waste. 3 cuts. 3 toes. He cauterized the wounds with the heated blade, the smell of burning flesh filling his small cabin, the smoke mixing with the smoke from his fire until the air was thick with it. Then he wrapped the wounds in clean cloth and he lay back on his bed and he waited for either healing or death. Healing came slowly, painfully, but it came. The storm ended on the 4th day, not gradually, not slowly, all at once like God had flipped a switch. One moment the wind was howling, the snow was driving, the world was chaos. The next moment, silence. Patrick lay in his bed and listened to the silence. It was so profound, so absolute that he thought for a moment he had gone deaf. But then he heard the fire crackling, heard the creak of cooling wood, heard the small sounds of a world returning to normal. He got up, slowly, carefully, testing his weight on his damaged foot. Pain shot through his leg, but he could stand. He could walk. He could move. He limped to the door and opened it. The world outside was white, utterly white. Snow had drifted in fantastic shapes, sculpted by the wind into formations that looked like frozen waves on a frozen sea. His woodpile was buried. His outhouse was buried. Everything was buried under a blanket of white, so thick and so uniform that he could not immediately recognize his own property. The temperature was 37 below zero, but without the wind it felt almost warm. He stood in his doorway and breathed the still, frigid air, and he thanked God that he was alive, minus 3 toes, permanently limping, but alive. 170 yards to the west, Gunnar Torvalds emerged from his cabin to find his family intact but damaged. His fingers had survived mostly. Blackened and tender, they would never be quite right again, but he would keep them all. His children's toes were worse. Frostbite had claimed tissue that would take months to heal. His youngest boy would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. But they were alive. Wilhelm Brouwer emerged to find his woodpile completely depleted. Every log he had cut and split and stacked for winter. Every piece of green wood he had meant to season for next year. Gone. Burned. The price of keeping his fire hot enough to overcome the Venturi effect that had turned his chimney into a liability. He was going to have to cut more wood immediately. Green wood, wet wood, wood that would burn poorly and fill his cabin with smoke all through the coming spring. It was a setback, a significant setback. But he was alive and his wife was alive, and that was what mattered. The homesteaders of Pembina County dug paths to each other's places in the days that followed. They checked on neighbors. They assessed damage. They counted the dead, which mercifully were few, and the injured, which were many. And somewhere in those first days after the storm, someone asked the question, what about the Russian woman? What about Elena Volkov in that dugout by the river? Gunnar admitted he had assumed she was dead. Nobody could have survived in that half-buried hole, he said. Not through 4 days of 40 below temperatures. Not through a storm that had nearly killed him 47 feet from his own door. Reverend Holmgren suggested they ought to go check. See about a Christian burial at least. Whatever differences they had with the Russian woman about religion or building practices, she deserved a proper service. She deserved to be laid to rest with dignity. So 6 men set out across the frozen prairie, following the line of buried fence posts that marked the path to Elena's claim. Gunnar, Wilhelm, Patrick limping on his damaged foot, Reverend Holmgren, and 2 other homesteaders who had survived the storm and come to help. They carried shovels. They expected to dig. They found Elena's doorway marked only by a small drift easily cleared. The mounded earth of her roof had shed the snow, the shape of her dugout emerging from the white landscape like a small hill, unremarkable, undamaged. Gunnar knocked. He waited. The door opened. Heat rolled out in a wave that stopped all 6 men in their tracks. Warm air, 70-degree air, air that felt like summer compared to the 37 below cold that gripped the world outside. Elena Volkov stood in the doorway. She was wearing a light dress and a simple shawl. No heavy clothing, no layers, no sign of the desperate struggle for warmth that had consumed every other household in Pembina County. She looked at the 6 men, at their frostbitten faces, at their hollow eyes, at the shovels they had brought to dig her grave. And she asked in her broken English, with genuine concern in her voice, "Are you all right? Do you need help?" There was a long silence while 6 men processed what they were seeing. Gunnar Torvalds stood at the front of the group, his frostbitten fingers still wrapped in bandages, his face still raw from the ice crystals that had torn his skin 3 days earlier. Behind him, Wilhelm Brouwer clutched his hat in both hands, his engineer's mind already racing through calculations he had refused to accept for 2 years. Patrick Brennan leaned on a walking stick he had carved that morning, favoring his right foot, trying to keep weight off the 3 missing toes on his left. Reverend Holmgren held his Bible against his chest, as if it could protect him from the impossibility of what he was witnessing. They had come to bury a dead woman. They had brought shovels to dig through frozen earth. They had prepared themselves for the grim work of extracting a corpse from a collapsed dugout of carrying remains back to consecrated ground of performing the rituals that gave meaning to death on the frontier. Instead, they found warmth. The heat pouring from Elena's doorway was almost physical, a wave that rolled over them and reminded their frozen bodies what comfort felt like. 71 degrees. The thermometer was visible, just over her shoulder, hanging from a nail on the earthen wall, its mercury line standing at a number that should not have been possible. Elena looked at them with concern in her pale gray eyes. Real concern. Not the satisfaction of someone who had been proven right. Not the smugness of a woman whose neighbors had doubted her and been shown the error of their ways. Just simple human concern for people who looked like they had been through something terrible. "Are you all right?" she asked again, when no one answered. "Do you need help, Wilhelm?" Brower was the first to find his voice. "May I come in?" His words were almost a whisper. "May I look at your heating system?" Elena stepped aside and gestured them through the door. The entry tunnel descended 4 steps into the earth, creating an airlock that prevented heat from escaping every time someone entered or left. The men filed down one by one, their boots echoing on the packed dirt floor. Their breath no longer crystallizing in front of their faces because the air was warm, impossibly warm, summer in January warm. The dugout opened before them, 20 feet long, 14 feet wide. Cottonwood beams supporting a sod roof that had kept out the worst storm in living memory. Oil lamps casting yellow light across walls of packed earth, across a sleeping platform in one corner, across a small table where Elena's German Bible lay open to a passage in Psalms. And beneath their feet, the floor radiated heat. Wilhelm knelt down and placed his palm against the packed earth. It was warm to the touch. Not hot, not burning, just warm like sun-heated stone on a summer afternoon, like the memory of comfort, like everything his own cabin had failed to provide during 4 days of howling wind and killing cold. How, he asked. Elena did not answer immediately. She moved to the firebox in the northwest corner and opened the iron door so they could see inside. There were coals in there, not a roaring fire, not the desperate blaze that Wilhelm had maintained in his own stove, consuming wood as fast as he could feed it. Just coals glowing red, barely enough to heat a single room by conventional standards. "Channels," Elena said, pointing to the floor. "Smoke go through channels. Heat stone. Stone stay warm." She traced the path with her fingers, showing them where the channels ran beneath the packed earth, 43 feet of limestone passages that snaked back and forth, absorbing heat from the smoke, before it finally exited through the low chimney shaft at the far end of the dugout. "One fire in morning," she continued. "Burn 2-3 hour. Channels get hot. Floor get hot. Stay hot all day. All night. Next morning fire again." Wilhelm did the math in his head. 2 or 3 hours of burning per day. Maybe a quarter cord of wood per week. Compared to the 2 cords he had burned every day during the storm, the 18 cords he had consumed in 4 days just to keep his family alive. The efficiency ratio was staggering. It was not 340% as he had calculated before. It was more, much more. In the conditions of the blizzard, when wind had turned every conventional chimney into a liability, Elena's system had performed at perhaps 800% efficiency compared to traditional designs. 800%. The number should have been impossible, but the evidence was standing all around him. Warmth, comfort, survival, achieved with a fraction of the fuel that everyone else had required. Gunnar Torvald spoke next. His voice was different than it had been before the storm. Quieter, humbler. The voice of a man who had nearly died 47 feet from his own door, who had watched his children suffer frostbite while huddled under every blanket he owned, who had learned in the hardest possible way that certainty was not the same as truth. "Can you explain it again?" he asked. Slower this time. "I think maybe I did not understand properly before." Elena looked at him for a long moment. This was the man who had told her she would not survive one winter alone. This was the neighbor who had laughed at her preparations, who had dismissed her building methods as the foolishness of a foreign woman who did not understand how things worked in America. This was the voice of every doubt she had faced since arriving in Dakota, every sneer, every patronizing explanation of why her grandfather's wisdom could not possibly apply to the northern plains. She could have refused. She could have reminded him of every dismissive word he had spoken, every knowing look he had shared with his wife, every assumption he had made about her competence and her intelligence and her right to exist on this frontier. But that was not who Elena Volkov was. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chairs around her small table. "I make tea. I explain everything." The men sat. Elena put a kettle on the coals, drawing heat from the firebox that was already warming her home. And while the water heated, she began to explain. She told them about her grandfather in Saratov Oblast, about the Pechka stoves he had built for families throughout the Volga region, stoves that had kept peasants alive through winters that made Dakota look gentle. About the principles he had taught her when she was 12 years old, principles refined through generations of trial and error, through centuries of learning what worked and what did not work when temperatures dropped low enough to kill. She told them about thermal mass, about how stone and clay and packed earth could absorb heat and release it, slowly turning a home into a battery that stayed charged for hours after the fire died. About how the horizontal channels maximized heat transfer, extracting energy from the smoke that a straight chimney would send directly into the sky. She told them about draft and dampers and the relationship between chimney height and wind exposure, about how her grandfather had learned to build low to protect the exit shaft from gusts that could reverse the draw and fill a home with smoke, about how the buried design used the earth itself as insulation, maintaining temperature stability that above-ground construction could never match. She spoke slowly, searching for English words, sometimes substituting German when her vocabulary failed her. But the men listened. For the first time since she had arrived in Pembina County, they actually listened. Wilhelm asked technical questions about the dimensions of the channels, about the composition of the thermal mass, about the optimal ratio between firebox size and floor area. He produced a small notebook from his coat pocket and began sketching, translating Elena's descriptions into diagrams he could study later. Gunnar asked practical questions about construction time, about material costs, about whether the system could be retrofitted into an existing cabin or required building from scratch. He was already thinking about his own home, about the chimney that had failed him during the storm, about how to prevent his children from suffering frostbite again. Patrick asked about maintenance, about cleaning the channels, about what happened if cracks developed in the limestone, about the lifespan of the system and the skills required to repair it. He was thinking about the decades ahead, about growing old on this land, about building something that would last. Reverend Holmgren asked about safety, about fire risk, about carbon monoxide, about all the dangers that had worried him when he first saw Elena's strange design. Elena showed him the clean-out ports she had built into the channels, the damper system that controlled airflow, the way the entire system was designed to fail safe to release smoke outside rather than inside if anything went wrong. The tea grew cold while they talked. Elena made more. The afternoon faded into evening, and the 6 men remained in her dugout, learning what she had tried to teach them 2 years earlier, finally ready to hear what they had refused to hear before. When they finally left, climbing the 4 steps to the surface and emerging into the bitter cold of a January evening, something had changed, not just in their understanding of heating systems, in their understanding of themselves. They had been wrong, all of them. They had dismissed Elena's knowledge because it came from a foreign country, because it was carried by a woman, because it looked different from what they had always known. They had let their assumptions blind them to evidence that was right in front of their faces, and they had nearly paid for that blindness with their lives. Gunnar walked back to his cabin in silence. His frostbitten fingers ached in the cold, a permanent reminder of the price of arrogance. His children would bear scars from this storm. His youngest son would limp for the rest of his life, all because Gunnar had been too proud to learn from someone who knew better. Wilhelm walked beside him, his notebook tucked into his coat, his mind racing with calculations and possibilities. He had built 17 houses in Milwaukee, 17 houses with conventional chimneys, with traditional designs, with techniques that suddenly seemed primitive compared to what he had just witnessed. How many families had burned more wood than they needed? How many had been colder than they needed to be? How many had suffered because Wilhelm Brauer, master builder, had not known what a Russian peasant woman knew? Patrick limped along behind them, his walking stick punching through the crusty snow with each step. He thought about the 3 toes he had lost, about the surgery he had performed on himself with a heated knife, about the permanent damage he would carry for whatever years remained to him. If he had built differently, if he had listened differently, if he had been willing to set aside what he thought he knew and accept that maybe someone else had learned something valuable. The Reverend Holmgren brought up the rear, his Bible clutched against his chest, his mind wrestling with questions that went beyond heating systems and construction techniques. He had suggested that Elena seek better prospects in Minneapolis. He had implied that a woman alone could not survive on the frontier. He addressed his doubts in the language of Christian charity, but underneath they had been doubts about Elena's competence, Elena's knowledge, Elena's right to exist in a space that men had claimed for themselves. She had proven him wrong. She had proven all of them wrong. And in doing so, she had revealed something uncomfortable about the nature of wisdom, about who possessed it and who did not, about the assumptions that shaped how people listened to each other. Wisdom does not always arrive in familiar packages. That was the lesson of Elena Volkov's underground chimney. That was what the storm had taught them, written in frostbite and frozen cattle, in the slow dawn of understanding. Word spread through Pembina County and beyond. By March of 1876, homesteaders were coming from as far as Grafton and Grand Forks to see the Russian woman's underground stove. They arrived on horseback and in wagons traveling miles across the frozen prairie, driven by stories that seemed too remarkable to be true. A heating system that burned one log where others burned 10, a dugout that stayed 70 degrees through the worst blizzard in memory, a woman who had survived alone while families all around her had barely held on. Some were skeptical. They brought their own thermometers to verify the temperature. They brought their own firewood to test the system. They demanded demonstrations, measurements, proof that what they had heard was not exaggeration or fantasy or the kind of tall tale that frontier people told to pass the long winter nights. Elena showed them all the same thing, a small fire carefully built, channels that absorbed heat and released it slowly, a floor that stayed warm for 24 hours on 2 hours of burning. She answered their questions, patiently explained the principles, repeatedly drew diagrams in the dirt when words failed her. Some understood, some did not. Some went home and tried to copy what they had seen, building their own versions of the horizontal channel system with varying degrees of success. A few got the details right, the thermal mass ratios and the draft requirements in the damper positions that made the difference between a system that worked and a system that filled your home with smoke. Others got them wrong and their attempts failed, and they concluded that the whole thing was some kind of Russian trick that only worked for people who knew the secret. But word continued to spread. And by the following winter, the winter of 1876 to 77, there were 14 homes in Pembina County built with variants of Elena's system. Gunnar Torvalds was the first to ask for her help directly. He came to her dugout in May, hat in hand, a different man than the one who had told her she would not survive. His fingers had healed, but remained stiff, permanent reminders of the storm. His children were healthy again, but his youngest son still limped and always would. "I want to rebuild my chimney," Gunnar said, "the way you built yours. Will you show me how?" Elena considered him for a long moment. This was a hard thing he was doing, asking for help from someone he had dismissed, admitting that he had been wrong. Pride had to be swallowed. Assumptions had to be discarded. A lifetime of certainty had to be reconsidered. "Yes," Elena said, "I show you." She spent 3 weeks that summer working alongside Gunnar and his family, helping them tear out the old chimney and dig channels beneath the cabin floor. It was difficult work retrofitting an existing structure. The cabin had to be jacked up. The floor had to be removed. Channels had to be excavated and lined with stone and covered with thermal mass before the floor could be replaced. But when they finished, when Gunnar lit the first fire in his new system and watched the temperature climb while the flames died to coals, he understood why it had been worth the effort. His cabin stayed warm that winter. Warm in a way it had never been before. Warm without burning through his entire woodpile by February. Warm without his children huddling together under blankets, without his wife coughing from smoke, without the constant fear that they would run out of fuel before spring. And Gunnar, who had never thanked anyone for anything in his life, thanked Elena Volkov. Wilhelm Brauer approached it differently. He was an engineer, a builder, a man who understood systems and materials and the principles by which structures stood or fell. He did not just want to copy Elena's design, he wanted to understand it, to improve it, to adapt the principles to different contexts and different materials and different construction methods. He spent months studying her home out, measuring every dimension, calculating every heat transfer coefficient, documenting everything in notebooks that would eventually fill an entire shelf in his cabin. He corresponded with engineers in Milwaukee and Chicago, sharing his findings, asking questions, seeking to understand how Elena's traditional design fit into the broader framework of thermodynamics that Western science was only beginning to formalize. What he discovered surprised him. The principles behind Elena's system were not primitive. They were not the crude guesswork of illiterate peasants. They were sophisticated solutions to complex problems, refined through generations of empirical testing, as valid as anything published in American engineering journals. Similar systems had evolved independently in multiple cultures. Korean ondol systems used underfloor heating channels that ran beneath entire houses. Finnish contraflow stoves used complex internal passages to capture heat before it escaped. Chinese kang beds heated sleeping platforms with exhaust from cooking fires. Russian pechka stoves, which Elena's grandfather had adapted, had kept families alive through Siberian winters for centuries. These were not accidents. They were not coincidences. They were examples of human ingenuity applied to universal problems, different cultures arriving at similar solutions through different paths of trial and error. Wilhelm began to write papers, letters, articles for the publications that served builders and engineers in the growing American West. He described Elena's system in technical detail, providing measurements and calculations that other builders could use. He gave her credit, always naming her as the source of his knowledge, acknowledging that everything he understood about efficient heating had come from a Russian immigrant woman who spoke broken English and had never attended a day of school in her life. Some readers were skeptical. Some dismissed his findings as exaggeration. But others listened and others built, and the knowledge spread. Patrick Brennan rebuilt his own cabin in the summer of 1877. His design was simpler than Elena's, adapted to his limited resources and his damaged body. The channels ran beneath his main room and a small sleeping alcove using flat stones from the river arranged in a pattern he had learned by watching Elena work. The results transformed his life. He burned 70% less wood than he had before. His cabin stayed warmer than it had ever stayed with a conventional fireplace. The chronic cold that had plagued him through previous winters, the numbness in his remaining toes, the constant shivering that had become so familiar, he no longer noticed it. All of it faded as his home became a place of genuine comfort. Patrick would carry a limp for the rest of his life. The 3 toes he had cut away with a heated knife would never grow back. But he would never again suffer through a winter the way he had suffered through the blizzard of '76. He would never again have to choose between burning his furniture and freezing to death. He would never again face the brutal arithmetic of fuel consumption that had governed frontier survival since the first settlers arrived. Elena had given him that. Her knowledge, her willingness to teach, her patience with a man who had spent 2 hours trying to talk her out of building the system that had saved her life. The Reverend Holmgren became the most unexpected advocate of all. He had been worried about fire safety when he first saw Elena's design, about carbon monoxide, about all the ways that unconventional heating could kill the unwary. But after studying her system for 6 months, after watching it perform through another winter, after consulting with Wilhelm about the engineering principles involved, he became convinced that Elena's approach was not only safe but superior. He began including sketches of the heating system in letters to friends and family back in Wisconsin. He described it as a practical application of Christian stewardship, using God's resources efficiently, wasting nothing, surviving through wisdom rather than brute force. He preached sermons about the virtue of learning from others, about the sin of pride that prevented people from accepting knowledge that came in unfamiliar packages. Not everyone appreciated the message. Some of his congregation grumbled that the Reverend was spending too much time talking about Russian stoves and not enough time talking about Scripture. But others listened, and some of them built. By 1880, there were 43 homes in Pembina County using variants of Elena's system. The designs varied. Some people used brick instead of stone. Some built the channels in different configurations. Some combined elements of Russian pechka stoves with German Kachelofen techniques, creating hybrid systems that drew on multiple traditions. But they all shared the same fundamental principle: maximize thermal mass, minimize heat loss, use the earth itself as insulation, work with physics instead of against it. Elena Volkov proved her homestead requirements and received her land patent in 1879. The land office clerk who processed the paperwork was not the same young man who had laughed at her drawings 5 years earlier. That man had moved on, transferred to an office somewhere in Minnesota, probably still convinced that Russian heating systems were impossible and that immigrant women did not belong on the frontier. The new clerk was older, more experienced, less inclined to laugh at things he did not understand. He had heard about Elena. Everyone in Grafton had heard about Elena by that point. The Russian woman who had survived the blizzard, the builder whose design had changed how people thought about heating on the northern plains, the homesteader who had done what everyone said could not be done. He stamped her paperwork without comment. He handed her the patent that proved she owned the land she had claimed 5 years earlier. And if he noticed that she was one of the first single women in Pembina County to prove up successfully, he did not mention it. Elena walked out of the land office with a document that represented everything she had worked for, everything she had survived, everything she had built with her own hands in a place where people had expected her to fail. The land was hers, the dugout was hers, the knowledge she had carried from the Volga River to the banks of the Tongue was hers to share or keep as she chose. She chose to share it. By 1885, there were 17 single women who had filed claims within a 10-mile radius of Elena's dugout. They came because they had heard about her, because they knew that survival was possible, because they had seen proof that a woman alone could build a home and work the land and make a life on the frontier without depending on a husband or father or brother to provide for her. 12 of them built some variation of her heating system. They came to her for advice, for instruction, for the kind of practical knowledge that books from Chicago and Philadelphia could not provide. She taught them what she knew. She showed them the drawings her grandfather had made, now worn thin from handling the ink fading, but the principles still clear. And they survived. Most of them. The frontier was still hard, still dangerous, still capable of killing the unprepared or the unlucky. But Elena's students had an advantage that other homesteaders lacked. They had wisdom that worked. Elena never married again. She never left Pembina County. She built a proper house above ground in 1882, a frame structure with glass windows and a shingled roof, the kind of home that announced permanence and prosperity to anyone who passed by. But she kept the dugout. She used it for storage, for root cellars, for a summer kitchen where the earth's coolness kept food fresh during the hot months. The heating system in her new house incorporated the same principles as the original channels running beneath the floor of her main room and bedroom, burning a quarter quart of wood per week to heat a space 3 times larger than the dugout had been. She became a fixture in the community. The Russian woman, Elena, the one you went to when you had questions about building or heating or surviving on the plains. She attended services at Reverend Holmgren's church, sitting in the back row, following along in her German Bible, never quite fluent in the Swedish liturgy, but welcome nonetheless. She watched her neighbors prosper. She watched the county fill with homesteaders, with farms, with the infrastructure of civilization spreading across what had been empty prairie when she arrived. She watched railroads come and go, watched towns rise and sometimes fall, watched the frontier recede until it existed only in memory and old photographs. She grew old. The winters grew milder, or perhaps she only thought they did. The blizzards still came, but they no longer seemed as threatening. The cold still descended, but it no longer seemed as deadly. Whether the climate had changed or only her perception of it, she could not say. Elena Volkov died in 1903 at the age of 60. The winter that year was mild enough that nobody needed exceptional heat. The temperature rarely dropped below zero, and the storms that came were ordinary storms, the kind that frontier people had learned to shrug off as inconveniences rather than threats. She died in her sleep in the house she had built above ground, in a bed that sat over channels filled with stored warmth. Her last fire had burned that morning 2 hours of gentle heat that would have kept her comfortable through the night if she had lived to see it. They found her peaceful, eyes closed, hands folded, as if she had simply decided that her work was done and it was time to rest. The funeral was held in Reverend Holmgren's church. He was old himself, by then past 70, his hair white and his hands trembling. But his voice was steady when he spoke about Elena, about what she had accomplished, about what she had meant to a community that had first dismissed her and then learned from her and finally embraced her as one of their own. He did not mention the underground chimney directly. He did not need to. Everyone present knew the story. Everyone had heard about the blizzard of '76, about the 6 men who had come to bury her and found her offering them tea. The story had become legend by then, told and retold around winter fires, embellished perhaps, but true in its essence. A woman alone had survived what families had barely endured. She had done it with knowledge, with wisdom, with the accumulated experience of generations carried across an ocean and applied to a landscape that killed the unprepared. That was her legacy. Not the land she had claimed, not the house she had built, but the knowledge she had shared, the techniques she had taught, the proof she had provided that survival depended not just on strength or resources, but on understanding. Elena's land passed to a niece who had immigrated from Russia in 1891. The niece had come because Elena had written to her, had described the opportunities available in America, had promised to teach her what she needed to know to build a life on the frontier. The niece had learned well. She maintained the property for another 43 years, raising children who raised children, building a family on the foundation that Elena had established. The dugout itself survived until 1946. By then it was a relic, a curiosity, a reminder of a frontier era that seemed impossibly distant to people who heated their homes with coal furnaces and looked forward to the day when electricity would reach even the most remote farms. Someone decided it was time to fill it in. The roof beams were rotting. The sod had long since grown over into ordinary prairie grass. The heating system beneath the floor still existed, limestone channels filled with decades of accumulated debris, but no one had lit a fire in the old firebox for years. They filled it with earth. They smoothed the ground. They erased the last physical trace of Elena Volkov's first home in America. But in photographs from the 1930s, you can still see it. A low mound beside the Tongue River, barely distinguishable from the natural contours of the land. A door facing south. A chimney rising only 18 inches above ground level. The place where a Russian woman had proven that traditional knowledge could outperform American confidence. The place where wisdom had kept one person warm while an entire community nearly froze. The place where the rules of survival had been rewritten by someone who refused to accept that the old ways were the only ways. The men who doubted her came around, not because she convinced them with words, but because a blizzard had provided evidence that could not be argued with. 43 degrees below zero and 4 days of wind had made believers out of skeptics, had turned theory into practice, had transformed what had looked like a foolish waste of stone into the most practical building in Pembina County. In that moment, when Gunnar Torvald stood in her doorway, feeling heat that should not have existed, seeing a woman comfortable in her shirt sleeves, while his own children showed frostbite, he had understood something important, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that he would pass on to his children and his children's children. Wisdom does not always arrive in familiar packages. Survival sometimes requires setting aside what you think you know and accepting that maybe someone else has learned something valuable that you have not. The confidence of experts is not the same as truth. The traditions of your fathers are not the only traditions that work. Elena Volkov had built her chimney beneath her cabin because that was where the heat belonged. Down in the earth, where it could be stored and slowly released, where it could not be stolen by wind or wasted on empty sky. And when the worst storm in a generation came screaming down from Canada, when temperatures dropped to levels that killed unprepared men and women across the northern plains, when conventional wisdom failed and conventional chimneys became liabilities, instead of assets, that underground chimney had kept one Russian woman warm with less wood than her neighbors would have needed for a single day. That was not just survival, that was wisdom. That was what it meant to be truly prepared for the frontier. Not just with tools and supplies, but with knowledge that worked when it mattered most. The fire burns low and the channels hold the heat, and the earth gives back what the flames have given it. This is what Elena knew. This is what her grandfather taught her. This is what she carried across 4,000 miles of ocean and prairie and doubt. Build low, build deep, build with mass that absorbs and releases. Let the earth work for you instead of against you. And when the wind howls and the temperature drops and everyone around you is freezing in their efficient American cabins, you will be warm, you will be comfortable, you will be alive. That is the lesson of the underground chimney. That is the legacy of Elena Volkov. That is what the fire beneath the earth has always known, waiting for those wise enough to listen.